State of the collection. I get asked to do one all the time. But if I'm being honest, the idea of doing a full state of the collection fills me with anxiety. From doing the channel, I've become a bit of a watch hoarder. It's chaos here. In fact, regular viewers may have noticed the ever-growing mess of watch boxes back there. And the last time I did one, it wound up being this 2.5-hour live stream with Dave and Alton, which I think was a great way to do it because it was interactive. But even then, there were a lot of things I just glanced over. And if you ask me how many watches I actually have here, I honestly can't tell you. I think a year ago it was around 130. I got rid of some, but I also got a lot more back in over the last year. So probably more, and I really need to thin out the herd this year. The point is that I can't really think of a good way to do a full state of the collection in this format and have it be a video with any substance. It'd be way too long, and even then I'd just be showing off a watch and rambling names every few seconds, and never really go into what's important and why. But I had this idea. Rather than do a full state of the collection, what if I did a state of the core collection? And I decided to do this in 2 parts. Now the first part is what you're watching, and this is going to be my true core collection. These are my favorites, these are the ones I wear on more of a daily basis, and perhaps the most normal. At least normal for me. And the idea here is that, let's just say something's happened and I can only keep 12 watches. Everything else has got to go. So out of the watches I currently own, I have a 12-slot watch box and I gotta fill it up. So I'm gonna go over what I'd put in it and why. So again, there are a lot of my favorites here, but this isn't just my top 12 favorite watches. I actually kind of went into this trying to create a balanced collection. I'm gonna talk a little bit about that too. And then I'm going to follow this up with a part 2, and this is going to be more my state of the quirky collection. The watches I don't necessarily wear that often, but are a little bit more unusual, and because of that, I'll never sell them. Anyway, that's enough of an intro. Let's get going with all this. So up first in my core collection is my 41.5mm Oris Aquis caliber 400. Kind of a mouthful, and I should mention that the order here is kind of the order that came to mind as I was making all this up. So this really is kind of my train of thought, with the first half of these being pretty easy to decide upon, and then it became increasingly difficult to include and what to leave out. Now, some of you may be surprised to see an Oris Aquis here, as I still haven't made a video on it. And I really need to. I've actually had this one for a while now. And because of that, I should probably go into a little bit of why I actually bought it. The short version is that I became really curious about Oris as a brand. To me, they're kind of like the Volvo of the watch community, or at least Volvo when they were more independent, as they have their own real history and heritage, yet never made it as big as other brands. But they're still big enough that they're doing their own unique thing, the caliber 400 being proof of this. And they also sort of exist in this in-between space between luxury and high-end, at least from what other brands are doing, kind of like what Volvo does. But the more I learned about Oris, the more curious I became. And one of the watches that I always liked the look of was the Aquis, even though it was a bit big at 43.5mm. However, 2 things happened. The first is that they introduced a smaller 41.5mm version. And the second is that it came with a new caliber 400 movement. And at that point, at least for me, it became the perfect modern day luxury or high-end diver. Because this is a true spec monster. I mean, you got the power reserve of 50 fathoms, the magnetic resistance of a Milgauss, and all in a watch that costs a fraction of those. Plus the 10-year service interval and a 10-year warranty, all rolled up in a design that I really liked. And after having it for a bit, I can say that it's just about everything I hoped it would be. Now, I don't really like the faux screws on the crown guard, and I'm not a fan of the goofy proprietary lug system here, but I love everything else. When it comes to divers, I've always liked designs that emphasize the dial more than the case, and that's exactly what this is. It's kind of like the opposite of a turtle. And I love that it's a little bit more of a dressier diver too, with the polished sections on the bracelet, the flashy framing of the indices, and let's not forget the absolutely gorgeous sheen of this anthracite dial. Plus, it's comfortable and fits perfectly on my wrist. Basically, if I'm going to spend a good chunk of money on a diver, this is what I want it to be. Something that's both beauty and beast. Which is something you can also say about my second watch, the Seiko Glacier Marine Master Reduced. or the SBDC 167. When I started picking out watches for this, I decided to start with my two favorite divers and then move on to other types of watches, just to cover my bases. Now, don't get me wrong, I have other great divers as well, such as the Wise 88 and the Zello Spearfish. Love both of those. But if I could only keep two of them, it's going to be this Oris and the Glacier Seiko. Now, I think the Oris is a better diver in almost every way, but I gotta admit, I love the Seiko more. The special edition Glacier dial is so gorgeous, unique, and captivating. It's a textured pale blue that doesn't really match anything, yet somehow seems to go with everything. Seiko is a master of making amazing dials, and outside the Grand Seiko line, I think this is one of their best. But the great thing about this watch is that it's not just about the dial. The Marine Master style case is also fantastic, and I think it's one of their best designs. And overall, this watch is just the perfect balance of flash and tule, form and function, dial and case. I love the aggressive angled lugs here, yet I also appreciate the subtle curvature of the sides. And then there's a large polished chamfer mixed with this very thin brush side. I mean, for me, everything about this watch is just about the perfect balance, with the one exception being the lume. Now, overall, compared to all watches, it's okay, but if you're talking about a Seiko, it sucks. And I can admit that the bracelet could be a tad bit better. Even with all of that, though, it's still one of my favorites. One of the reasons I limited myself to just two divers is because I knew I wanted to have a GMT here, and most of the best GMTs out there are dive-style watches, which can easily double as a diver. And out of all the ones I have, and I have plenty at this point, my favorite is easily the Jack Mason Dr. Pepper Stratotimer, which they released this year as an official collaboration with Dr. Pepper, making this perhaps the most Texas watch I've ever seen. And because of that and the colorway here, it's also pretty unique. When it comes to GMTs, there are plenty of Pepsis out there, plenty of Cokes, but this is the only Dr. Pepper I've seen. And it's also great that it doesn't look anything like my other two divers. So, variety. It's also pretty sharp on its own, maybe a bit more toolier than the others, as well as being rather understated for a GMT, which for me is one of the makings of a great travel watch. The other being comfort. And that's another area where the Stratotimer excels. At this point, I've probably been on 5 or 6 trips with some version of the Stratotimer, and it's practically perfect for that. It's not too big, not too tall, just about the right size for anything. Plus, that 9075 is great to travel with. And even though some of you won't care, I do love the fact that this is a Texas company, and that the watch is assembled here in the USA with further regulation. Now, yes, you can always regulate a watch yourself, but it's kind of nice when you don't have to. And the two that I've had are spot on. So I love this one, and I gotta admit that every time I see the lume, I do smile a little. Just from the Dr. Pepper Easter egg that's hidden there. And I even had to share a shot Haunted Mansion style when I was at Disney World. Up next just happens to be my top watch for last year, and a watch that I called my microbrand grail. And that's the Grey Manta Triumph. It's sort of this dressy field watch, which honestly is one of my favorite types of watches, as it combines the easy-to-read effectiveness of a field watch with touches of refinement, making it a watch you can really wear anywhere, from hanging out at the beach to a nice dinner out. So it's kind of along the same lines as a Seiko Alpinist or Hamilton Khaki King, except thanks to Manta, it's made a little bit better than either of those. And I love the fact that it has a very original and different design for a field watch, where it's a mostly printed dial, except for these very oversized indices at the cardinal points, giving it not only a very interesting look, but a pretty effective one too, even at night when the great lume kicks in. And the icing on the cake is just how slim and sleek the case is, with a width of 30.5 millimeters, a lug-to-lug of 47, and a total thickness of just under 9.4. For this kind of watch, it's absolutely perfect for my wrist. And all of that with 150 meters of water resistance and a screw-down crown. So it's a good-looking, go anywhere, do anything, one watch collection type watch. And I think it's one of the best Explorer alternatives out there, as it kind of fills that same niche, but it does it without being an homage. So if I was truly paring down my collection, this would definitely be one of the keepers. After the Manta, I started thinking I need at least one dress watch to have a balanced collection. Now, I don't have a ton of dress watches, but I do have a few that I really like. Ones that are a little more visually interesting than your standard sterile clean designs. And out of all of those, I decided that the Orient Star Standard, or as I like to call it the Cheshire, would be the one I'd grab. And part of the idea of this is also based on that I wanted to have at least one Orient Star and at least one watch with a pure piano black dial. Now, from the review, I know some of you look at this thing with the power reserve, the thicker profile, the loomed hands, and the brushed sides as more of a sports watch. But I still kind of see it more as a dress watch, or at least what I'd want a dress watch to be. And in some ways, it is Orient's answer to the classic SARB 033, which really was an all-arounder, a watch that could do everything. So either way, whether it's a sportier dress watch or a more elegant sports watch, I'm good with whatever you want to call it. Because for me, since I don't really need a dedicated dress watch, I'd rather have something that's a little more versatile. Something that I could wear more often. So this would be a perfect watch if I was actually paring down. It's comfortable, gorgeous, and reasonably priced. While some hate power reserves, I'm actually one of the people that like them. And I think this is also a perfect example of what's great about Orient Star, that they're consistently creating watches that punch way above their price point. And if you happen to be wondering why I call this watch the Cheshire, it's actually a name a viewer came up with. Because if you look close at that power reserve and the Roman numeral 12 at the top, it kind of looks like the Cheshire Cat smiling at you, making it kind of this little Easter egg that I also love. Chronograph. That was my next thought, that I should have at least one chrono, which is actually a pretty easy choice as I only have one nice automatic chronograph, which just so happens to be one of my grails, and that's the Hamilton Intramatic, a watch that to me is the perfect panda. With the bicompact design, it's just the right balance of random numbers and dials spread throughout, with a clean white space. And it's actually a watch with some history and heritage. It's a refresh of one of Hamilton's old watches, which just so happens to be one of the first automatic chronographs, and I think one of the first pandas as well. As well as it's a pretty decent value for what you're getting, or at least it was when I bought it. Now, it is a bit thick, there's no getting around that, and I think it's about 14.5 millimeters. But to be fair, most automatic chronographs are a bit thick, at least all the non-luxury ones. But even with all that chunkiness, I do still enjoy wearing it. After all, it's hard to go wrong with a panda. It's also a bit of a strap monster, which is good because I didn't really like the original strap. For a while, I actually had it on this really cool red rally strap. A little different, a little unusual, but I kind of love the red thrown in there. But recently I've more settled on this simple black shell cordovan with it, as it's the perfect shade of black, and it has this really great taper making it pretty comfortable. And as a side note for collectors, I think limiting the number of automatic or mechanical chronographs you have is a good idea. They're great, they're cool, but they're also a lot more expensive to service, and that's something you should just keep in mind, so don't go hog wild collecting these things. And with that, my theoretical watch box is half full. But I am still missing two very important types of watches here, the first of which is a good quartz watch. So I asked myself, what's my favorite quartz watch? And that'd be my Casio Oceanus S5000, a watch I obsessed over getting for a long time, before I just finally jumped on it. And I'm so glad I did. Love this thing. I think I've said this in a few other videos, but to me, this is the embodiment of true modern Japanese watchmaking. It's a watch that combines modern technological conveniences and combines that with high quality craftsmanship. And it's one that's still reasonably obtainable by most people. Don't get me wrong, Grand Seikos are amazing, but not everyone wants to drop 6 to 10K on a watch. This one is still expensive, and especially for a Casio, but it's a lot easier to justify. And in some ways, maybe it is a watch you really have to see in person to appreciate, because I'm still in awe at just how thin and lightweight this thing is, especially considering everything it can do. I mean, it's a chronograph, a world timer, it's got multi-band Bluetooth, perpetual calendar, fantastic lume, and I'm sure I'm forgetting a few things here. Although one thing you can't forget is this beautiful crystal clear domed sapphire. And all of this at around 80 grams on its titanium bracelets and just under 10 millimeters thick. making it a versatile, comfortable, sleek, and sexy powerhouse. It is a little bit complicated, but once you figure all of that out, it's one of the best grab-and-go quartz watches you can find, as it really does it all. Now at this point, some of you are probably thinking, you got every type of watch, what could you be missing? And that'd be a red watch. Which I know for a lot of you isn't exactly a necessity, but it is for me, as I've come to really love red dial watches, and I gotta have at least one. And this was a particularly hard one to pick. You see, I got my Kamasu on its funky strap code bracelet, which would be an obvious choice. Yet I also got a couple of really interesting unique prototypes that never went into production. And let's not forget my Orion Hellcat, which is a great example of what a microbrand can do. But lately, the red watch I've been wearing the most is my newer Bulova Jetstar. And bonus points here for just having a funky, unusual design, and being a bit more of a versatile sports watch. And let's not forget the high accuracy quartz movement with this just amazing sweep. It's not perfect, I mean, far from it, and no watch ever really is. And there are a few things that I'd definitely change, but this one overall was a home run for Bulova. I love it. It's weird, it's funky, yet just comfortable and eye-catching. And I like it enough that if I had to, I'd pick it over all my other red watches. So the Bulova Jetstar goes in the box. And with that, I think we actually got all the bases covered. And at this point, I really started thinking more about some of my older favorites, ones that I just have a really hard time getting rid of. And the watch that really represents that the most, that I just happen to have sitting here, is my Hamilton Khaki King in the champagne colorway. If I'm being honest, I actually haven't worn this one much this year, and a lot of that has to do with the Mono Triumph. But I love this one dearly, and I honestly can't ever see getting rid of it. It's a watch that takes the classic field watch formula and just turns it on its head, with the champagne dial and the day-date at the top, creating this kind of affordable day-date field watch hybridy thing, which I know sounds odd, but it does make it a great versatile watch, with a good-looking, easy-to-read design. Now yes, this is the Khaki King, and the 50 meters of water resistance sucks. I think that's one of the most well-known things about it. Hands down, I wish it had more. And honestly, that's one of the reasons the Manta's kind of replaced this as one of my travel watches. And yes, the stock strap sucks, but this one does look great with a lot of other better straps. And this one right here has been the one that's been on this thing the longest. This sort of two-tone-ish brown leather, which I think gives it a little bit more of a dressier look. But at the same time, I think it still looks great when wearing it with shorts and a t-shirt. That's really the greatest thing about the Khaki King. You can pretty much wear it anywhere with anything, as long as it doesn't include water. Now, if you are interested, there is a debate between what's better, the older ones with a high beat movement or this newer one with a Powermatic 80. And a lot of that's just going to come down to personal preference, but I gotta say I have come to appreciate the 80 hours of power reserve. So again, this one's definitely going in the watch box. And bonus points here for helping to balance everything out with a gold dial. Along the same lines is the next watch, which I think is number 10. And that's another one of my old favorites, which is the Vario Empire. You see, I figured I had enough divers and sports watches, maybe a second dress watch would be a good idea. The only problem is that I currently have two Vario Empires, and choosing between them is pretty difficult. There's the original automatic with its crispy clean white galoche dial and brilliantly blued hands. And then there's the newer striking green Sector GMT version. They both wear great, and especially with Vario's Italian leather straps. And they both look fantastic, just in slightly different ways. Like I said before, clean, simplistic dress watches just aren't me. I'd rather have something that's a little more visually complex and interesting. And the original Empire was one of the first dress watches that I ever saw that really gave me that. It was one of the first watches that I reviewed that I went out and bought immediately after. While the GMT follows that same spirit with a slightly more different and maybe more cluttered design. When it comes down to it, I think it's hard to go wrong with either. But if I really had to pick between these two, I think I'd go with the GMT. Just for the extra versatility of having a green watch, as well as picking up another GMT. Last October, I went on a cruise and I took this, my Jack Mason Strata Timer, and my Garmin Instinct, and that worked out really well as a good travel set. So next time I go somewhere, might take the same set. All right, we're getting near the end, and up next is the Zodiac Olympus. It's a watch that I've called perfectly imperfect, meaning there are a fair amount of issues here, and criticisms as well. But at the same time, I love it, and I wouldn't change a thing. It's an odd, quirky, asymmetrical design that actually dates back to the early 60s. And it's one that didn't actually survive the decade. But more recently, Zodiac did decide to bring it back. And I think it's actually their most interesting watch. No one else has anything quite like it, with its sleek Stingray case and quadrant dial. Technically, this specific version is a dress watch, and there is a new larger field watch version out there as well. But this one, and specifically this one with the blue colorway, is pretty casual for a dress watch, making it a watch that's not exactly my first choice if I'm dressing up, but for everything else, it's a good choice, and especially after you ditch the blue watch strap it came with. Put on something a little bit nicer, and it's a fun, good-looking, very unusual watch to wear. Now, for the last watch, I had a really hard time deciding what to put in here. Because when I started this whole thing, I started writing down all my favorites, and I wound up with a list of about 40. I know, I got a problem. But the point is that there are only 12 spots, and I had a lot left I would have liked to include. At one point, I was thinking of putting down the Barometric Chronograph as another odd, quirky piece to have, and I think that would be the fun choice. And then I was also thinking about the Mandala from Second Hour, as it's another great-looking, beautiful blue sports watch. And I think that'd probably be the logical choice. But in the end, I kind of went with my heart, and I decided that if I could only ever have 12 watches, then this would be the last one I'd grab. And that'd be my Seiko Antarctica Monster. I wouldn't necessarily need another blue diver, especially when I have other better divers already. But I love this thing, and I just have a hard time letting it go. As I talked about in the review, I grew up near SeaWorld. Went there all the time as a kid, later worked there as a teenager. It was a good chunk of my life there. And one of my favorite things to do there was the penguin encounter. So every time I look at this watch and I see those goofy, stupid little penguin footprints on it, I smile. It takes me back. Don't get me wrong, it's a good-looking, capable diver in its own right. And I really like it on this hybrid strap. But for me, it's more emotional and sentimental. So that's 12, but there's one more watch I can't really live without, so I'm gonna throw it in here. So sort of cheating, but it's not really a watch that's collectible. That's my Garmin Instinct 2 running watch, and I wear this thing all the time. In fact, last year I probably wore this more than any other single watch out there, because I wear it when I run, when I work out, when I'm just walking the dogs early in the morning. It's also my main grab-and-go quartz watch, just because it lives on my desk while my others live in my watch box. And at the same time, it's also my beater. I mean, who cares about a few nicks and scratches after I've already sweated all over this thing? So, gets a ton of wrist time as well as abuse. And that's it. That's the core collection. And overall, I think it's pretty well balanced. Colors, styles, types of watches. And I like the fact here that everything's pretty distinct. No two are really alike. Now, keep an eye out for part 2, which is going to be in about a week or so, which is going to be the state of the quirky collection. The top 10 of my stranger, rarer, or quirkier watches that I own. But in the meantime, let me know what you think down below. And if you have any questions, like why I didn't include a specific watch, like my Christopher Ward, feel free to ask that as well. And as always, if you enjoyed the video and want to help out the channel, like, comment, subscribe, start over from the beginning. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and I'll see you next time.